all Europe lived in fear of the Russians, unless you were a sympathizer, a communist sympathizer.
Right.
And interestingly enough, my French landlady, Madame Pigalle, was a French communist sympathizer, as was her son Leon. He was a baker. And they would tell me how wonderful the Russians are and how wonderful communists are and all that kind of stuff, all the time renting me their lovely home and gladly taking my American money in the way of rent. But lovely, charming people when all was said and done. Even Leon is, I can recall I was living in Paris, or I was living in France, I should say, at the time the Russians put Sputnik up, shortly after Sputnik. And Leon would say to me, oh, the Russians, they have it all over. Of course, he would say it to me in French, but he didn't speak any English. But he would say, the Russians, they will beat the Americans out. They will beat the Americans out. And most people don't realize not all French people love Americans. Americans bombed the dickens out of France because German troops were occupying France, and we bombed wherever they were. We ruined their railway system. We ruined their road system. We ruined their communications system. So a goodly number of French at that time remembered World War II and how they had suffered not so much at the hands of the Germans, but at the hands of the Americans and the British to some degree, but they remember those American bombers and all the bombs that they left. I remember the first time I took a train from Paris into Orléans and pulled into the train station at Orléans. And I looked all around me, and all these buildings were destroyed, lying in rubble. The train station was in rubble for all practical purposes. And this is 1959. This is 14 years after World War II. And here's the train station in rubble. And I remember saying and inquiring, why is this the case? You Americans bombed it. But that was 14, 15, 16 years ago. This is all the preparation for D-Day and subsequent to that. Why hasn't this all been built up? Well, we don't always have all the money you Americans seem to have. And there was a lot of jealousy and pettiness on behalf of the French in looking towards America at the time. Because America was living the great life. America was booming. Europe was still a shambles. Germany was still a shambles to a great degree. France was still a shambles. Italy was still a shambles. And here you are in 1959, 1960. You're still living the good life. Europeans are still getting themselves organized and structured, getting their money back to being of value and all that. Not like the Europe we see today, which is so wealthy and so well off. It was tougher in those days. We had what was called a communications zone. We were the backup for the army in Germany. So if and when the army started to withdraw with the onslaught of the Russian Soviet forces forcing their way across Europe, as everybody thought they would in those days. And everybody lived in fear because the Russian army was so massive. They had thousands and thousands of tanks, loads of aircraft, all that kind of business. We knew we were outnumbered, outgunned, and even if you put together British forces with American forces and French forces and any other military forces that we had in Europe, any other nationality, it still could not match what the Russians had, and the Russians had the Warsaw Pact with the Polish, the Lithuanians, the Hungarians, the Austrians, not the Austrians, but a lot of other nationalities that constituted the Eastern Bloc, which was all communist and under Russian control. And they're all their military forces under one military pact called the Warsaw Pact. And they were the enemy, and they were going to overrun us. And we knew that. So our job was simply to prepare for that and defend against it until reinforcements could be sent back from the States across the ocean in vast supplies and vast manpower and push the Russians back. And maybe use nuclear weapons if necessary, because that's the only thing that kept the Russians intact to begin with. There was only one nuclear power to begin with, and that was the U.S. And we had nukes in Europe. We had them stationed in Germany. And they were tactical weapons, and they were big weapons. And we had Air Force and air bases ringing Russia, all in Europe, all in the southern part of Europe, all in North Africa, all out in the Far East. We had one air base after another, and they only had one target, and that was the Soviet Union. Passage of time, more sophisticated aircraft, we were able to withdraw those, and so we did.